Listen, elections are political events, but they're also a cultural snapshot of a country. Mark Carney's still the prime minister. That has not changed. What has changed, though, is that the country might be more divided than it's been in some time. What does the election tell us about Canadian culture right now? The group chat's here. Let's go. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Okay, so right now it is Tuesday morning, and as of right now, as of us recording this conversation, the votes still being counted. About two dozen ridings still too close to call. We still don't know whether Mark Carney will lead a majority or minority Liberal government, but talk about a comeback. I mean, the Liberals were given less than 1% chance of winning this election just 4 months ago. After delivering his victory speech, I should say, video of Mark Carney getting down on the dance floor popped up all over social media. I just had to subject you to it for a moment because what you're hearing is Down with Webster, and it's like truly like the most Canadian experience to go. Down with Webster was this band that not everybody knows. You know, you really had to be there for that moment. But when you see this video, Mark Carney is just kind of like bouncing up and down. He's rapping along to the lyrics, and yeah, it looks like he knows all the words. Now, obviously, this is a political story, and this show is not a political show. This is the culture show. But as I mentioned, elections are a cultural story about how the candidates leveraged pop culture to connect with voters, how silent they were on just about every cultural policy and institution in this country, except for the CBC, of course. But perhaps more importantly, with all the conversations we've been having about Donald Trump and dominating every facet of this campaign, it's a story about how Canadian cultural identity, I think, kind of evolves to meet this moment that we are in. And that's the conversation that I want to have this morning. Gerson is in Calgary, Jesse Wente in Toronto, and Nicolas in Montreal. Welcome and good morning to all of you. How's it going?
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Just super.
Jen, I'm going to start with you because of that tone. I loved everything about this. Listen, the last time that you were on the show, Jen, we were talking about the Liberals being basically swept off the map, right? And instead, the Conservatives blow a 24-point lead. Pierre Poilievre lost his seat yesterday. Jen, what is your reaction?
Sort of grim laughter.
Okay. Great.
There's no politics wonk or nerd who doesn't appreciate a really radical comeback story or who doesn't appreciate a sort of a maximally chaotic outcome, because that just makes our jobs more interesting, right? But as it pertains to culture specifically, and because you played that clip, I would like to start off by noting that I find the elbows up stuff to be so painfully boomer cringe, I can't even begin with it. Look, I totally agree with the sentiment. We have to be aggressive with the Americans. Great. But this thing, I can't with it.
Tell me what it is about it that makes it so cringe for you.
It feels like boomer slacktivism. Right? That's what it feels like to me. It feels like when young people think that they're making a difference when they put out hashtags on Twitter or whatever, or posting about, Coney on Facebook. Like, I think most of us have grown out of that, but the boomers are still out there doing these like weird, highly performative gestures. And I don't know, I think the moment calls for people who are serious and adults. And I think one of the great appeals of Mark Carney and the brand that he's built for himself is that he's serious and adult. I don't want him dancing. I don't want him putting elbows up. I don't really care what Mike Myers has to say. I don't know. Stop it.
I have to say that, like, I follow a little bit of a different end of the spectrum on this, just because I think in these moments, you need something to rally around or push against. And it's something maybe like everybody can recognize, even if they're for it or against, at least there's something central that is kind of like pulling the narrative together.
Could we not have come up with something that's a little less embarrassing, though? Like, you got your pits, when we talked about what Canada needs to do in the last couple of months, over here at the line, we talked about, I won't use the words that we actually use because this is a real respectable publication, but it involves swearing. Yes. And it was like a maximally aggressive Canada was kind of what we're going, peak Canada.
Yeah.
Honey badger Canada. Like, I'm thinking like Beaver with his teeth out, just thrown his face into a log, you know, like just extremely aggressive, assertive. Like, was there not an animal we could have picked? Honey
Jen,
badgers, like.
Jen, if the campaign had been Honey Badger Canada, you'd be burying yourself underground because of cringe. Because it's the same thing. Like the idea of figuring out some kind of rallying cry to juxtapose ourselves against the United States, like no matter what it is, it's bound to be a little like, oh, we're not used to doing something like this. And I want to turn to you on this, Emilie, because you know the Bloc Québécois could hold the balance of power here if we end up with a minority government when all these votes are counted. But I want to take a moment to listen to something that the leader Yves-François Blanchet said last week. Let's listen to this.
We are, either we like it or not, part of an artificial country with very little meaning called Canada.
An artificial country with very little meaning. That's Blanchet talking last week. Elections are this exercise in cultural imagination. It gives us an opportunity to say collectively, you know, who do we want to be? Maybe it's not elbows up, but like, who are we this morning, Emilie?
So first of all, I want to say, I don't know about the meaning, but the part about artificial country makes sense. I mean, all countries are artificial, so are, or I guess they're human-made. So
Yes.
are cultures, so are languages, so are every lines that we drew on also maps, which are also artificials. And so in that sense, he's right. I just think where I disagree with Yves-François Blanchet is that he also believes that there are such a thing as natural country, and that Quebec is a part of those natural countries. And so that's where we have a disagreement. But yes, Canada is artificial. And when you look at where Canada comes from, a lot of it is basically fear of American expansionism, mid-19th century, when the US was believing in its manifest destiny and trying to go west, and ways that we know exactly in which ways that entailed for Indigenous peoples who were living west, and all of that. And Canada was basically trying to match that energy, and basically taking advantage of the Civil War in the US, where you had that really interesting name floating around, Confederacy of States, and taking advantage of the gap in American growth during the Civil War because of Reconstruction, to really rush to build a confederation up north, so that we could basically catch the Americans off guard and take them by speed, and have our own confederation of British colonies up north, so that they would not be able to expand up there. So to go back to your question of who we are this morning, interestingly enough, I think this moment in Canadian history is like going back full circle to a place where people realize that Canada is essentially an artificial invention that was created to stop basically American expansionism. So back in the days, it was maybe about railroad and land grab and other things. This time around, it's about sometimes canceling your trips to Florida and buying other things besides orange juice. But it is that moment where you realize that as a project of collective imagination, the invention of Canada was always tied to trying to block the Americans from being a little bit too much.
There's by design, the three of you are speaking from different locations that, let's say, have like a tenuous relationship to this construct, this artificial country that, as in terms of Blanchet's words, called Canada. Jen, you are in Alberta. Emilie, you're in Quebec, and Jesse, you're an Anishinaabe person. So when you sort of speak about this sort of speaking from this place of tenuous relationship with this construct, what does the result tell you this morning about the cohesiveness and the coherency of that identity?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think I'm easily the most well-rested person on this panel, because I was in bed and asleep by 10:30. Because again, as an Anishinaabe, I'm not sure there has been an election in my lifetime that was a huge difference maker. Our position is always we have to continue to work for our own return of our own sovereignty and our own ways of being and knowing. And as the chair of a federal crown corporation, my role is to work with whoever's in government and work to make that operation work the best it can. So I went to sleep. In terms of what I think this speaks to Canada, I think both Emilie and Jen really touched on important aspects to it. I think this was an election, as much as maybe us on this panel and you, Elamin, would want cultural issues to be more forefront in terms of the cultural products and sort of the output of a culture and maybe even cultural identity. I think it is true that culture was in that Canadians spoke to like how we're going to try to be distinct or reinforcing the idea.
Yeah.
And I think Canadians also did what they often do, which is seek comfort in familiarity. And I think that's sort of where we've ended up a bit, and hopefully that will work out with the threats that given the American president's comments right before the election, seem will likely to persist for the foreseeable future.
Well, it wasn't just right before the election. It was also on the day of the election. I mean, Donald Trump put out a post on Truth Social. He said, hey, Canada's having an election today. They should elect me, which as far as I know, he was not on the ballot anywhere. I checked all of the writings, and I don't think he was running in any particular one. But Jesse, I want to hold on the idea that you said about the notion of sovereignty and the ways that it's playing in this conversation, because what you said is important. I was meeting with the students in our Indigenous Pathways program, which is a program that CBC runs for Indigenous journalists across the country, and they kind of like travel across the country, meet with different newsrooms. And I was really struck by something that they'd mentioned to me, which is they said it's really interesting to hear older white people use a word that we'd only heard used in the context of Indigenous people, which is the word sovereignty, because to them, that had been strictly an Indigenous word. It has not come up from quote, older white people until this election. What do you make of the shall we say, the mainstreaming of sovereignty as a context and as a concept in this election?
Well, I think it's not at all surprising that that Canadians in Canada and those seeking to lead the country would seek out sovereignty. I think it is, it's under threat in a way that it hasn't been in really my lifetime. And I think one of the reasons you mentioned off the top how divided the country is, and I think one of those challenges is not maybe securing Canadian sovereignty throughout the time. Not having the conversation means that you might leave it vulnerable. One thing I would say, though, and it was interesting your comment about Indigenous students, because sovereignty is not, in fact, at least for Anishinaabe, that is not an Anishinaabe concept. We don't have a word that translates into sovereignty because I don't think we actually believe in it. We believe in right relations. Sovereignty suggests dominion over something else. That I'm sovereign and thus I have control. And that's not really how Anishinaabe see the world. We see it as a network of relationships that have to be maintained, of which human beings are just a part of it. And so I don't seek sovereignty over the land or other people. I seek right relations. Now, we speak about sovereignty because it was all of that ability for us to live that way was taken away by the imposition of Canadian sovereignty. And so, yes, we do use that framework, I think largely, Elamin, so that we can be understood in this struggle. But to me, sovereignty for Anishinaabe anyway, is simply a tool to get us back to the right relationship networks that we had pre-colonialism.
I want to zoom in a little bit more on the notion of culture and how culture kind of played a role in this election, because Jen, from the day I think the writ was dropped, it was kind of like called this vibes election, right? Like the idea that like it didn't hinge on one specific policy or one specific offering a platform. It was the question, or at least one of the questions we were asking, is who's best to deal with Donald Trump? Who's best to deal with the White House in this moment? And part of that came down to whether you want someone who is relatable to you, whether you want someone who is, a guy who went to Harvard and Oxford, a star banker, the kind of president who like literally you saw, in a show like The West Wing, if you want sort of an example of how those kinds of representations pop up in pop culture. Mark Carney that we saw, through pop culture when he was on Jon Stewart's show or the 22 minutes election special, he had a very different, I think, presentation from the person that we met given those stump speeches. Listen to this.
Recently, at one of your rallies, a lady shouted out, "Lead us, Big Daddy." And people say you have...
I've never met that woman
people say you have big daddy energy. And Reuters, the reputable news agency, recently said that you have a blend of tough talk and bland competence, which is, I think, a way of saying they find you boring.
Jen, to the extent that politics are impressionistic, which version of Mark Carney do you think we're going to get leading this government?
Well, look, I do want to talk about technocratic daddy energy because I think it's a real thing.
Okay.
But the first thing I
Get
do
in
want
there.
to respond to is just quickly to what Emilie was talking about all countries being artificial. I think that's correct. But Blanchette would have a whole lot more credibility to talk about the artificiality of Canada if Quebec stopped taking Canada's artificial checks filled with artificial money. So, like, until we start having conversations about ending equalization payments and health transfers and things like that, I don't think that a lot of people in Quebec have a great leg to stand on criticizing the artificiality of Canada. On that note, but yes, back to technocratic daddy. I think I discussed a couple of months ago when Carney was first chosen leader of the Liberal Party. I said, look, he gives me technocratic daddy energy. And I think that is what people are potentially looking for in a moment of significant instability, especially vis-a-vis a larger partner, right? They're looking for adult in the room. They're looking for someone who comes across as mature, someone who comes across as a person who's competent and has things handled. And I think that speaks to a deeper need in the Canadian psyche. And I think one of the things that really differentiates us from Americans is that deep in our darkest hearts, we're not democratic, we're technocratic, right? I don't think that we have the same kind of super individualistic, super freewheeling democratic impulses that the Americans do. We're less inclined to engage in sort of direct democracy, for example. We don't like to elect people like judges like the Americans do. We are much more technocratic. And by that, I mean, in our heart of hearts, we really just like to appoint competent experts to take care of it and know that it's going to get fixed, right? Like, I think we like to absolve ourselves collectively of responsibility for governing and just have faith, a high trust faith kind of scenario that like smarter people than us are in charge of things and they've got this handled. And it's a part of why we have, I think, a higher degree of social cohesion and social trust. But it's also why I think we're also in some ways more fragile and more vulnerable when that social cohesion and social trust, especially in our institutions, starts to collapse, right? Because if we can't trust the technocrats to take care of us, well, my God, what do we do now? That creates this void and this opening for real populist movement, which I think is something that Pierre Poilievre is taking advantage of right now. But part of the reason why I think Carney has been as successful as he is, it's not because of the specific policies he's put forward, because frankly, the policies he's put forward haven't been particularly impressive. But he gives that strong technocratic, we're going back to the 90s, we're going to rebuild, like he gives that strong kind of energy that I think speaks to Canadians' impulses to just be taken care of.
If folks are just joining us, my name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is the morning after the election edition of Commotion. Jen Gerson is here, Jesse Wente's here, and Emilie Nicolas is here. And I really appreciate you being here for the first time, Emilie. That's great. Look, I want to play you guys a clip from last night's victory speech from Mark Carney, where he described an essential cultural institution in his victory speech last night.
Unis, nous avons bâti des institutions culturelles essentielles comme CBC Radio-Canada.
Emilie, when Pierre Poilievre was campaigning against Justin Trudeau, defunding the CBC was not just a rallying cry. It was his biggest applause line at every rally. While the plan was to, still in the Conservative platform, they didn't, talk about it as much during the actual campaign. The Liberals tried to make that a wedge issue in the middle there for a little while. I don't think that quite worked. Why do you think it didn't work?
I don't know if it's why it didn't work, but I was saying earlier that Canada was created to basically try to match the American energy, and CBC Radio-Canada was created exactly with that intent, like explicitly. In the 1930s, it was created because out of a national commission that had as a point of concern that American radio was basically taking over the Canadian air waves, and that Canadians were listening to too much American content, and that we might lose our sense of existing basically as a really, really young, invented nation if we didn't do something about it. And so that's when basically the ancestor of the CRTC was created. And this is also when CBC Radio-Canada was created, basically as an effort to invent Canada by making sure that people from Nova Scotia and people from Vancouver were listening to the same show in their different time zones. And so that's why the institution was created. And so that's why I think right now is the worst time to try to go at this kind of symbols, because now is the time when people realize the most why those things exist.
Yeah.
As far as like Francophone Canada is concerned and Quebec is concerned, there's also this idea that if we don't create institutions that are for us, by us, there is nothing out there that will ever be like us. And there is this sense that, maybe CBC is trusted, but Radio-Canada is like beloved because it's something that comes out of basically the expression of a different people. And it's out because of that reason, it is so precious, and not just, the public broadcaster, but just the ecosystem of media stands for something symbolically that people really, really do not take for granted. And so I think it became basically a lightning rod for people realizing that protecting difference is something really, really precious, and something that is basically embedded in the immune system of Quebecers. And a lot of them who are at core nationalists decided to vote Liberal maybe for the first time in their lives last night because of that core immune system reaction of like, culture first, we'll deal with whoever's in power afterwards.
First of all, two quick things before I get to you, Jesse. Number one, I love that every Emilie answer begins with, well, you got to know your history for a moment. And then you would not be that surprised in terms of like, where you are now. And I appreciate you sort of bringing that history to every one of your answers so far. And two, is become quite clear to me that I'm going to have to hold on to you guys past the bottom of the clock. So if folks are listening on the radio, there will be a longer conversation on podcast version or also on YouTube. Stay watching if you're on YouTube. Jesse, the fact that Mark Carney called the CBC a cultural institution that's essential, that's great, lovely. But throughout the campaign, the parties were basically silent on the platforms on every other cultural institution, or just on culture in general. What do you make of that? What does that tell you?
Well, I mean, I don't think that's that unusual, Elamin. I mean, I think the CBC is often brought up because it's the single largest cultural institution in the country. But I think you don't tend to see a lot of debate in federal elections around cultural policy and cultural institutions. Otherwise, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. It's hard because it's difficult to necessarily wrap your hands around something that is intrinsically valuable and not as sort of accountable as can for industry, like you can.
But isn't there a
distance,
distance, Jesse? Isn't there a distance between the idea that like this election is largely about Canadian culture and about our differentiation from America, and then the parties actually being able to speak about culture? Because you think, at least in this election, you would have expected to hear them, kind of explicitly talk about it just a little bit more, don't you think?
I mean, you're asking someone who would have dreams of those moments, Elamin. I would love to have an election where those things are front and center. Yes, it would be great, but I think it was very much in keeping with. Listen, I think there was very clearly other priorities. That yes, they have there's definitely a cultural through line and a very important one there. Yeah. But it's not where most people's minds go to, because most people go to life, eating, food, housing, their everyday part, the music that surrounds that, the art that surrounds that tends to come a little bit later. But I hope that we see some embracing of that dialogue, and I hope that from this government that it's not just the CBC, but it's a recognition that all culture across the country, regardless of language and where it is very valuable, and that we need to start treating culture not as its own, like the siloed thing, but actually the connective tissue that makes industry, education, government, all of the parts of our society, that's the lubricant that makes all of that work, and that we need to pay a little more attention to that, and that would help us be a little more resistant as a unified country against forces that are seeking to divide us along those lines.
Yeah, I think the idea that culture becomes an afterthought in these moments has always been a frustration, because I do think that like any time that you articulate your priorities, you are in fact articulating something that has to do with culture. It's an undercurrent as much as as much as it is just sort of a separate policy area. Having said that, I also understand that nobody's going to vote on the National Film Board. Like whoever those people are who are going to the polls being like, I really care about the specific institution, and that's the thing thing that's going to decide my vote. Aside from Jesse, I don't think a lot of people are going to do that. Look, if you're watching on YouTube, please continue watching. On the podcast version, this will be a longer conversation. We have to say goodbye to our radio audience. Thanks for the folks who are listening on the radio for tuning into this conversation. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We'll be back tomorrow, and we will see you then. Okay, Jen, I want to pick up on the conversation with the CBC, because when you look at these final results, Pierre Poilievre did not only did he increase the conservative, vote share, he got a larger share than Harper did in 2011, and in 2011 Harper got a majority. Clearly some of the ideas that he was communicating were resonating quite a bit, and one of those was the idea, this vow of defunding English CBC. What do you think happens to that sentiment now in this moment?
Okay, so I will get to that, but first I would also want to point out other cultural policies were overwhelmingly not discussed during this election, C11, C18, and C63.
That's true.
And we should get into those because those are actual real on-the-ground policy decisions that the Liberal government's made that are having actual impacts, especially on independent media here right now, today. But yeah, why was the defund the CBC stuff so de-emphasized during the election, but so overemphasized during the lead up to the election is an interesting question. Yes, I do think there are a significant number of Canadians, a significant plurality of Canadians who feel that the CBC has lost faith with its mandate and who feel that the CBC has become too ideologically driven and does not represent them and therefore is failing to serve its role. Whether or not you personally agree with that I will leave that up to you. But I do think that if the CBC wants to have a long-term future, it needs to do some work to rebuild trust and connection in communities outside of Toronto. I will say that in Alberta, we're starting to see the CBC do that very thing. I still think the CBC is doing really good things in Alberta. Yeah. It's expanding itself to, for example, smaller communities. It's building bureaus in places like Lethbridge and Medicine Hat. It's doing town halls in smaller communities. It's eating a lot of SHIT. And that's the necessary process that is going to have to happen in order to rebuild connections and trust in these communities. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think the CBC understands that it's got a problem, and I think that the CBC is doing the work to try and ameliorate that problem. And I think that a Carney government buys the CBC a couple more years potentially to try and make the idea of defunding the CBC less politically palatable, particularly in rural Canada. That's a really important thing, because if you can get rural Canada back on board, and if you can get a lot of people in rural Canada to realize that the CBC is an asset and not an enemy, and if you can get people in rural Canada to see that, like, look, the private sector can't deliver news services to your communities in the way the CBC can because it's just not viable, it's just not profitable, there's a path there. But I think the CBC has some significant work to do. And like I have long been called for, look, there's a conservative case for the CBC, but the CBC needs to readdress its mandate. I think that its mandate should be taken out of the Broadcasting Act and should become a standalone thing. And I think that we need to have a national conversation about what we're expecting of the CBC. Because one of the problems I think that the CBC has is that its mandate is very vague and very open to interpretation. And therefore, the CBC tries to be everything to everybody, and it's got a limited budget, right? You can't be everything to everybody. You have to be specific in what your goals and outcomes are, and you have to be able to apply a budget correctly aligned with a mandate in order to fulfill those goals. Look, that's my whole side shtick. Yeah. Why did Pierre kind of drop this during the election? Yeah. The answer is because I think it just made him sound too Trumpy. Like, I just don't think there's much more to it than that. I think that there's the mentality around and the sentiment around the CBC hasn't really changed dramatically. What has changed is that Pierre had to come across as more adult, more reasoned. This was very obviously a cultural wedge issue that I think just made him sound a little bit too MAGA. So he toned it down. I think that's all there is to it.
Emilie, I kept on seeing those videos. I mentioned this on the broadcast yesterday, but I kept on seeing those videos of, Pierre Poilievre speaking at rallies with the plane behind him, and the accusation was out like, this is just like Donald Trump. And then, of course, on literally the same day, Mark Carney did the exact same thing, and it was like, wow, this is different. And the idea here is that, like, there is something to the sentiment that Pierre Poilievre is closer to Donald Trump. That, like, when you see those images, something about that resonates more more than seeing, Carney and Trump do the same thing. And so I was just kind of like struck by the thing that Jen said, but like the idea of de-emphasizing the defunding the CBC plank of the platform because it does sound a little bit too Trumpy. Did you get the impression that Pierre Poilievre spent a lot of this campaign trying to tone down the visual, the cultural echoes of Donald Trump throughout the campaign?
I think he did. I think it's like atavism, basically. I think it's like whenever he says something that sounds Trumpy, he doesn't quite realize, but he's been trying. However, I think it's a good opportunity to dig deeper on this whole like sovereignty aspect of it, because we've been talking about the CBC as a way to basically protect the Canada as a country and as a national security basically device that was created against American culture. I think there's something to be said as well about social media now in a way the ways in which it has already transformed the ways in which things have been going on in the House of Commons. Like if Meta, X, and whatnot are creating a world of algorithms in which you need to have really short clips that go viral to be able to be heard as an MP, and that those algorithms are all American made. In a way, I think even before this election, as Canadians, we were losing sovereignty over our political culture. And I think there was a really big gap in terms of like this American way of doing politics, which is incredibly polarized and polarizing, that matches up to a point in American society in which people are more racially segregated, socially segregated, but also politically segregated. There's a lot of Democrats who are Democrats. Basically, it's a family tree of Democrats, and the same thing with the Republicans, and they don't necessarily encounter each other that much on the streets and communities, while as in Canada, except maybe in Toronto or some parts of Montreal, Canada is small enough that you're gonna have, definitely in Quebec, like you're gonna have your parents being separatists and your children not being in that and having those family arguments at the same dinner table. And the ways in which in the House of Commons last fall, we even heard through Radio-Canada investigation, actually, that the Conservatives MP were not allowed to speak, even just speak informally with MPs from other political parties. That was a way of doing politics that was completely disconnected from the ways in which most Canadians have daily conversation with colleagues or with neighbors or with people in their communities. And so I think, to me, the conversation about Canadian sovereignty and Canadian sovereignty over our political culture goes deeper as well. And it's about how do we make sure that the ways politicians behave and relate to one another actually matches who we are as a country. And I think because of social media, because of the ways in which we're not sovereign of our own, of the public sphere basically doesn't belong to us anymore. It belongs to Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. And so as long as we have that, there's a ways in which we're not controlling our public square, and that has impact on our political culture. And I think Pierre Poilievre represents that sense of loss of like, this is not a personality that was created by Canadian-made ecosystems of political conversations. And I think that's a deeper conversation that I wish we were able to have without making it partisan, because it could have happened in other political parties as well. But it is a conversation about which personalities are rewarded by the Canadian political system. I think we lost control over that one. And that's, I think, maybe the introspection that would be helpful right now.
I think that that phrase, first of all, is going to stick around with me for a moment. That idea of like losing sovereignty over a political culture, that without really necessarily even noticing, we started to import political imagery, and then also we started to import political, I guess, like shorthand and telegraphing. And then you actually lose control over the arena in which these conversations actually take place. And I say this because last week on this very show, we had a conversation about what it looks like when, places like Facebook and Instagram no longer are able to, sort of host or say they will not host news sources, reliable news sources. But the majority of Canadians on those platforms still feel like they are getting the news. Well, they're not. They are not receiving news. They're not seeing news from credible news sources. What they're seeing, by and large, and the New York Times did an investigation on this last week, as did the Financial Times. But Front Burner was the first, for CBC's Front Burner was the first place to sort of flag this, about saying the political culture on those platforms is changing because some far right pages are actually filling that gap, and people are not noticing the fact that they are still, that they're not receiving news because they still feel like they are receiving the news. And that's a cultural conversation. That's a cultural conversation about, the arena in which, these conversations actually take place. Jesse, I want to give you the last word here. We're a show about culture first. So I want to ask you about what these election results might mean for culture in this country, particularly in this moment where, as Emilie said, we might be losing sovereignty over our political culture. We talk about our politics differently, maybe without us necessarily knowing or realizing that. So do you see anything about these results where in this moment where culture might be the thing that binds us, that might be the thing that sort of makes us go, all right, we are going to be able to push back American influence? How would you like to see the federal government leverage that potential from these results in the months ahead? Like, what's your wish? What's your dream, pal?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I don't get often to get asked what I want to dream. I would say, I'm not sure I saw like the election itself necessarily as a cultural sort of expression or summing up there, maybe where the country sits. I'm seeing that more in just Canadians. Like, I think there's an energy. And so I think the opportunity to have a really constructive dialogue about some of these cultural issues, which we just don't have enough in this country, is presenting itself right now. And I would, as someone who does have a leadership position in one of these institutions, certainly I think it would behoove us and all of our colleagues to engage very actively in this discussion. Because to pick up on something Nicolas, Emilie said that I thought is so smart about this sovereignty of political sort of discourse, I would even take it further. I think just worldwide, and Canada is part of this, we're in a battle for this. We're losing the sovereignty of our attention. Of just our own intellectual space is being very crowded upon. And to pick up what Jen said, we have some policies that intersect with this. Bill C-11, Bill C-18. We should be looking at how those are working and whether those need reform. I mean, we don't open up the Broadcasting Act very often at all, but it's semi-cracked. And this is evolving so quickly, I think it would behoove the government to take a close look at how that's functioning, and for it to recognize that one of its roles should maybe be to get in the way between giant multinational technological corporations who are seeking to erode just Canadians' ability to pay attention to anything, and get in the way of that, like be a block in between that. And then I think I would love to see we need to have increased resources, because I think something else Jen said is very, very true, not just of the CBC, which is that over the last 30 years, particularly on the national level, national Canadian cultural institutions have all sort of pulled back from regions and become very centralized. This is all due to financing and policy over, the last 30, 35 years. And we see the results, which is that in places where they are not as present as they used to be, people have lost trust and faith in them. And so that should be a message to all of those institutions to go to and do. If the CBC is doing that in Alberta, I can tell you Canada Council is doing that in Alberta as well. It would, and not just Alberta, the North, all over the place, because if we want to rebuild Canadians' trust and belief in the institutions that make up whatever Canada is, well, then they actually have to help Canadians. And they have to help Canadians where they are and not demand that they figure out how to navigate Ottawa. And we can just do that. Like you can just start making decisions that allow that to happen and start reallocating resources to let that happen. And it would make everything more stickier. If there's a question, if we're a divided nation where people are really wondering, what is Canada? Well, start to do the stuff that makes people believe in it again, which is in where they live, not and not necessarily grand gestures. It can be really small things about just getting folks back to recognize that this stuff matters to them in their personal lives. And frankly, the government in all sorts of ways has regressed from that, where Canadians can say, what does the federal government actually do for me? And all institutions, arm's length institutions, even NGOs that are federally, are meant to serve the entire country, should all be constantly listening to that and understanding, how do we serve everyone regardless of where they are and meet them where they are and design policies to do that, so that they can have faith in this whole idea of having national institutions and not just local and territorial, but ones that really speak to this larger project that, as an Anishinaabe person, we have our complex relationship. But I always speak from a place of what my ancestors, which was a belief that this could work, and we just have to put in the work to make it work.
Listen, I said that was supposed to be the last question, but also like it is now this undercurrent, this echo of what Emilie just said about this idea of losing sovereignty over our political culture. I just want to maybe close with Jen on this, because what Jesse's getting at there is maybe an anxiety over emphasizing a national narrative at the cost of the recognition that we are a country of regions, and we are very good at being a country of regions, and sometimes overemphasizing that idea of a national narrative ends up costing you the ability to connect with people in those specific regions. So what do you make of that divide? That idea that like even that is maybe a political import from the United States, who does have a pretty robust, let's say, national narrative of what America is. That's not really the way that we do things around here.
Well, I don't think it's an either or conversation, right? Like you can have a reach out to local communities and feel that regions are represented while still having an overarching national narrative. I don't think it's a one or the other. But I think the best way that for me to tie all of these ideas together is to finish off by talking about the cultural impact of C-18.
Okay.
C-18 was the particular legislation that the Liberals passed that tried to save news and prevent misinformation by essentially putting a price on news, so forcing these big American tech giants to pay for the news that they were distributing on their respective platforms. And many people, including Meta, including independent media, including many people, testified and told the Liberal government that this fundamentally misunderstood the business environment, this fundamentally misunderstood the incentives of news distribution, and they didn't listen, and that this was going to fundamentally harm all media, but independent media that were trying to come up in this environment in particular, because Facebook was saying, if you put a price on news, we're just going to pull news. Like that we're if you put an artificial price on distributing the news, it doesn't make sense for us to pay it. We'll just pull it from our platform.
But Google did give $100 million though, right? Like Google did.
Well, I can get into the Google stuff if you want, but the Facebook stuff is what's relevant here.
Yeah.
Because what happened was all of us warned the government that this was going to happen and that this was a terrible bill that would harm us in the long run. The government didn't listen. They decided to listen to their own chosen sort of legacy media lobbyists and experts. They moved forward with C-18. Facebook did exactly what it warned everybody that it was going to do, and it pulled the news. And the great hypocrisy of all of this is this fundamentally harmed, especially independent media outlets who are more dependent on social media in order to grow their respective audiences. It hurt us algorithmically. It opened up a giant vacuum from which disinformation and misinformation now has a greater platform than it did previously. And the great big hypocrisy of it all, and the thing that makes me so angry, is you know who didn't pull themselves from Facebook? The political parties.
Yeah.
The liberals are all over Facebook. The liberals are paying Facebook to spread
to
their
run
advertising.
ads. Yeah.
The liberals literally, part of the reason why they were so successful in this campaign is because they had great Facebook game. So they just kicked us off while they hypocritically maintained their hold on these platforms. And all of this, the questions of political sovereignty and the importation of our political culture remain relevant in that environment. But now we can't play. Now we can't operate as an independent Canadian news operator in that space. It's an extraordinary hypocrisy. And if you want to get into the money that Google was forced to put aside, Google was also giving money to Canadian media outlets prior to C18 as well. And it's a real question as to whether or not Google's actually put more money into the ecosystem now versus prior. So we might be actually worse off now financially. I know I can tell you we are financially worse off when you take in the value of the distribution that we've lost. So, I mean, C18 was a disastrous policy that was a perfect example of the Liberals governing at their absolute worst because they failed to actually listen to people who were outside of their bubble. And for me, that sums up everything that went wrong with cultural policy in the previous government, everything that I really do hope that this next government tries to rectify.
The illusion of elections is always that the country is somehow different entirely the next day when it's not, right? Like elections are a snapshot of where the country's at, but also the issues that were relevant yesterday remain relevant today. And then you basically have maybe a different toolkit to deal with those. This is obviously not going to go anywhere. In fact, in just the last 20 minutes, all three of you have raised individual points that each of them could be entire shows on their own. So we're definitely going to return to this conversation about our political culture in this moment. But I got to leave it there for now. And I got to say thank you to all of you for being on the show. I really appreciate your time. Thank you again so much, you guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elamin.
Yes, of course. We'll definitely talk some more. All right. Jesse Wente, currently a storyteller in residence at Toronto Metropolitan University. He was not speaking to us in his official capacity, but he's also the chair of the Canada Council for the Arts. Emilie Nicolas is a columnist with Devoir. She's in Montreal. Gerson co-hosts The Line, a Substack and podcast out of Calgary. For the latest on the federal election, go to cbc.ca. In the meantime, that is it for the show today. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We'll be back tomorrow. See you then.